You're probably like me, someone who grew up with a game that piqued their interest when they were young. And as you've grown older, you continue to follow that game as it grows into something beyond its original boundaries, inevitably evolving into something unrecognizable at times for both good and bad reasons. And that's what The Legend of Zelda has been for me. In more recent years, I've been exploring the massive world of Hyrule, set eons after all the other tales. In my teenage years, I freed a twilight-enveloped Hyrule and the neighboring dreamlike land of Termina. As a child, I explored the high seas with a greedy but lovable captain trying to save a dear friend. And my furthest memories were as a toddler being exposed to the series-defining masterpieces of A Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. And today, I want to take you on a journey through my first exposure to my favorite video game franchise, explain to you why I love it, and in the process explain why I love Zelda as a whole. Just keep one thing in mind, folks. The legend started here. First thing I should address is an apology to all the people saying A Link to the Past isn't the first Zelda game. I am fully aware of that. A Link to the Past is actually the third game in the mainline series. Just give me a little bit of time to explain why I'm so bold to say that it really started here. But before I explain that, let me go over the history of The Legend of Zelda up until the release of A Link to the Past, or Zelda III. I'll be calling it both interchangeably. So The Legend of Zelda was a video game released on the Japanese exclusive Famicom in 1986, but didn't release in America until 1987 on the NES. It establishes the gameplay of the Zelda series, exploring a big world, discovering secrets, and progressing the game after completing dungeons and utilizing items that you've gotten throughout your journey. These same items also allow you to access places that would otherwise be unreachable. Some reoccurring series items make their debut in the first Zelda game. Series staples like the bomb that breaks walls, the arrow that can shoot enemies from any range, and boomerangs that stun enemies, and in some games hurt them. It changes from time to time, but usually it stuns enemies. And that's just to name a few. The game establishes Link the hero, Zelda the princess, and Ganon the bad guy. We don't really know that much about Ganon, he's just a pig-looking dude. We also learn of Impa, Zelda's nursemaid. At this point in the series, you'd know about her if you read the manual, and it's also in the manual where we get the prologue to the game's events. Impa was being chased by Ganon's minions, and while on the run, a young boy named Link appears and drives off those same monsters. After being saved, Impa tells Link about the evil Ganon and how he kidnapped the princess, and that Ganon holds something called the Triforce of Power, so in order to defeat him, Impa sends Link on a quest to get the pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom, because rebuilding it will give him his only fighting chance. And in-game all it really does is turn on the lights, but you know, we're here for the lore. After collecting all the pieces, restoring the Triforce of Wisdom, and getting his hands on the silver arrows, Link defeats Ganon, and the Triforce of Power appears on a pile of ashes that used to be Ganon. This is totally just a cool visual that'll never be referenced in a future game. Link saves Zelda, and with both Triforce pieces united, they live happily ever after, until a year later when Zelda II comes out. Zelda II is a good game, but it's extremely different. The overworld exploration looks the same, but whenever you encounter an enemy, you enter a location that's kinda like a side-scrolling view. And this is how all combat interactions are done in this game. And this game is only combat. Rather than focusing on items, the game focuses on leveling up your strength for fighting, your magic for ability use, and your health for health. Zelda 1's dungeons were fairly easy and quick to navigate, but Zelda 2 has more like these long corridors and elevators that take you to different floors. For a lot of people, it's the least Zelda-like game, and I can agree to some degree, but I feel like that perspective sometimes denies the things that Zelda 2 brought to the series. This is the first game to have towns, because all the towns in Zelda 1 were wiped out before the game's events. The town names were eventually recycled into the names of some characters in future games, specifically the sages, and Mido, or Mido, I don't care. This game takes place 6 years after the events of Zelda 1. Here as the player, you find out that the inhabitants of Hyrule escaped the chaos of Ganon and his army by escaping to the north of Death Mountain. So this is entirely new land. The entire map of Zelda 1 resides on the bottom left corner of the map. So really, if you kind of scale that compared to the rest of the map of Zelda 2, you see how much bigger this adventure is. Bigger on a more physical scale, I mean. Anyways, one day Link discovers a strange mark on the back of his hand, and when Impa sees this mark, she tells Link about the hidden third piece of the Triforce, the Triforce of Courage. It was hidden away by a past king of Hyrule, an unknown amount of time in the past. When he was younger, he inherited the throne and part of the Triforce, but he wanted the whole thing, and he was furious that he only inherited a piece of it. Meanwhile, his sister Zelda inherited the knowledge of where the others were located. After refusing to tell her brother where the other pieces are located, a magician that had been working for the royal family since the previous king's reign cast a magic spell on Princess Zelda. You could see him in this art here, kind of manipulating the king's actions. Anyways, that same wizard casts a spell on Zelda and puts her to sleep. This Zelda has been asleep for possibly centuries, maybe even longer. Because of this, the king made a law that every woman in the royal family should be named Zelda, and since then, that Zelda has pretty much been waiting to be awakened. After Link collects the Triforce of Courage, he'll be able to wake her up. And yes, this also means that there are technically two Zeldas. Actually, not technically. There are actually two Zeldas. The one who's been asleep for hundreds of years, and the Zelda from Zelda I that's probably doing princess duties somewhere. Anyways, the Triforce of Courage is hidden away in a place called the Great Palace, and the only way to open it is by placing 6 crystals within other palaces across Hyrule. So Link's quest is to put all these crystals in all these palaces and then eventually get the Triforce. Sounds easy, right? Sure. But I need to talk about the enemies real quick here. Zelda I established series staple enemies like the bosses. You have no idea how I feel about the... You have no idea. If there's anything that I don't like about Zelda 2, it's probably the enemies. Zelda 1 establishes series staple enemies and bosses like Dodongos, Manhandla, Goma, Gleeok. You know, and some of them have returned in future entries. That's why I call them series staples. Zelda 2, however, I mean, aside from enemies that return from Zelda 1 and 2, this game has the most amount of enemies in a Zelda game that don't appear in future iterations. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, please, because I am unsure, but I really don't remember the last time I've seen, like, a Geru, right? This is like the precursor to a Lizalfos or a Daimonophos or something, I don't know. The Iron Knuckle is a new, like, enemy that appears in a future game. It also has its cousin, the Dark Nut. Aside from those two, like, I really don't know, and, like, Geru is pretty much a stretch. Everything else, I don't even know, like... I don't hate these enemies, but it bothers me that there's kind of like, in a sense, wasted potential where these could have been reused or reworked in a future game in a sort of way, you know? The final boss is Zelda 2, though. In order to test Link and see if he's worthy of inheriting the Triforce of Courage, he has to go against his own shadow, which was, funny enough, foreshadowed whenever he beat a boss. He was always there, just waiting in the background. Anyways, this is the start of my least favorite debate or explanation in the Zelda fandom, and that's classifying the difference between Shadow Link and Dark Link. Because there's a difference between classifying which links are Shadow Links and which links are Dark Links. If I remember correctly, I don't even think the Zelda wiki acknowledges this as either. I'm pretty sure they just call this Link's Shadow. So this is like a third entity. You can tell I'm going off script because I'm getting a little bit passionate here. Enemy rant aside, after Link collects the final pieces of the Triforce, he awakens the sleeping Zelda, and the curtain falls both metaphorically and literally on this chapter of Hyrule. Now the developers went and moved on to the origin of the world and legend of the upcoming game, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. But before continuing, I feel like I should emphasize a few things so we can all keep a couple mental notes of what I just talked about, because I kind of rambled a little bit. What Zelda 1 introduced to the series was items both for combat and world exploration. There was a world map and a dungeon map, although they were simplified, and a compass to locate the dungeon's treasure, in this case the Triforce shards. In later games, it'll be upgraded to be a chest locator in dungeons. You know, this game also established a lot of series enemies, series bosses, and the battle of good and evil for the Triforce. Zelda 2 was the first game to establish that there is always a Link and a Zelda. And in the games where Zelda doesn't appear, it's usually because it's a direct sequel to a game where she does appear. Another thing Zelda 2 established was that Hyrule has densely populated villages, but sometimes they're very far from each other. So that's why canonically in some games, sometimes you don't visit every village. Sometimes you'll only go to one. But in reality, they're all just spread out across the land. Also, Hyrule isn't always the same. A lot of the time, landmarks will exist in the same general positions, but the land around them is molded differently sometimes. Or sometimes the world exists outside of the land of Hyrule altogether. In this era of Hyrule, they've expanded to the north and the northeast. This game also establishes that Link can learn abilities rather than just using items all the time. Now, Zelda III, or Triforce of the Gods, or A Link to the Past, whichever name you choose, the game's context remains the same regardless. It takes the previous games and treats them like a draft, and then A Link to the Past becomes the foundation that Zelda I is trying to be. And no, I'm not saying that you should skip Zelda I, it feels very rewarding. Zelda II, it's fun, but play the Japanese version because that one is more balanced. As I said a bit ago, you can call this game Zelda III, A Link to the Past, or Triforce of the Gods, and it wouldn't really matter because the context wouldn't be lost. According to dev interviews, the game's manual, and the player's guide, this game served as a prequel to our previous venture through Hyrule. And it's right here, before we even start the game, where my love for Zelda lore truly started. And not the lore, but just Zelda as a whole. Especially since, despite the different sources, every piece is telling the same events. The player's guide, which I own, but I can't find where it is, it says as follows.
Although The Legend of Zelda appeared first in the series of Zelda adventures, it actually takes place many years after the third game, and then the book proceeds to tell you about Link's journey through the first two games.
The in-game cutscene says,
Long ago, in the beautiful kingdom of Hyrule surrounded by mountains and forests, legends told of an omnipotent and omniscient golden power that resided in a hidden land. Many people aggressively sought to enter the hidden golden land, but no one ever returned. One day, evil power began to flow from the golden land. So the king commanded 7 wise men to seal the gate to the land of the golden power. That seal should have remained for all time. But, when these events were obscured by the mists of time and became legend, a mysterious wizard known as Aghanim came to Hyrule to release the seal.
Okay, but now comes the question. What is the Golden Land? What is the Golden Power? Why did evil flow from the Golden Land, and who is Aghanim? Some of these questions can actually be answered within the manual the game comes with. And here's also where we get a lot of first-time lore drops that the series will carry on throughout the rest of the franchise.
The god of power dyed the mountains red with fire and created land. The god of wisdom created science and wizardry and brought order to nature. And the god of courage, through justice and vigor, created life. They left the world, but not before creating a symbol of their strength, a golden triangle known as the Triforce. A small but powerful portion of the essence of the gods was held in this mighty artifact, which was to guide the intelligent life on the world of Hyrule. The Triforce had the power to bestow 3 titles which gave the person who received them great powers: the Forger of Strength, the Keeper of Knowledge, and the Juror of Courage. From its hiding place in the so-called Golden Land where the gods placed it, the Triforce beckoned people from the outside world to seek it in the hope that someone worthy of these titles would find it. The Hylian people were endowed with psychic powers and skill in wizardry. It was also said that their long, pointed ears enabled them to hear special messages from the gods, so they were held in high esteem by many people in Hyrule. Their descendants settled in various parts of the world and passed on their knowledge and magical lore to all people. But in its passing, the lore was often distorted or lost altogether.
A creation story, the Triforce origin, and the Triforce grants titles and powers to people. In later games, it's explained that a person who touches the Triforce but doesn't have a balance of the 3 virtues of power, wisdom, and courage, the Triforce will split apart, and whatever piece best represents the person who touched it will stay with them, while the other 2 pieces look for the person who best represents the virtues of the other 2 pieces. Usually it's Ganon power, Zelda wisdom, Link courage. We rarely see anyone else take the other pieces of the Triforce unless by force. Let's backtrack to Aghanim, because he's really the catalyst for everything that's to come. The sealing of the Golden Land, otherwise known as the Sacred Realm, is an event known as the Imprisoning War. And no, this isn't the same Imprisoning War as Tears of the Kingdom. I don't know why Nintendo used the same name. Anyways, Aghanim is a wizard who becomes a royal advisor and heir to the 7 sages. Again, in this game it's called the 7 wise men, but I'm going to call them the 7 sages just because it's much easier for me to remember. After saving Hyrule from some disasters, which are unknown to us as the player, but we can assume these disasters were a setup to get closer to the king. He uses his close position with the king to brainwash the soldiers, assassinate the king, and open up a portal to the Sacred Realm, which has been tainted by darkness since the Imprisoning War of ancient times, so now it is known as the Dark World. Also, I just said it like a minute ago, but the 7 wise men are later retconned to being the 7 sages from Ocarina of Time. But then again, Nintendo can hypothetically change it in the future if they want to. Anyways, he yeeted 6 out of the 7 sages' descendants into the Dark World. This was an attempt to break the seal on Ganon. The princess of this era is the 7th descendant. While Zelda was imprisoned and waiting for her turn to be taken away, she made a connection. On this night, while sleeping soundly in his bed, our hero Link is awakened to the sound of her pleas echoing through his head. Link gets up and sees his uncle, his only living relative, who assumedly also heard the same thing, preparing for some sort of fight, sword and shield in hand, telling you not to leave the house as he rushes off. And this is where the game truly begins. Kind of off topic, but because the Super Nintendo controller has 4 more buttons, you can also play around with the new controls here. Also, this is the first time we're inside of Link's house. I guess in the other games he was like, kinda homeless. A is still the action button, but now you can use it to open chests, talk to NPCs, pick up and throw stuff, and push and pull objects when accompanied with the D-pad. B is still your sword attack, but now if you hold it down you can do a spin attack. In lore, this is a secret technique that belongs to the Knights of Hyrule and their descendants. Also, rather than stabbing like in the other 2 games, this game introduces diagonal slashing. Also, movement isn't limited to just up, down, left, or right anymore. Now it's omnidirectional. I assumed omnidirectional is the same as 360 movement. Anyways, the select button is to save your game, the start button leads you to the sub-screen where you can check out your items, key items, and gear, Y is the button to use your items, and X is to pull out the maps, whether it be a dungeon map or the world map. Technically not new to the series, but it's the first time we have one in this much detail. The map in Zelda I acted more like coordinates. After getting your lantern and playing around with the controls along the way, we make our way to Hyrule Castle, another location that's being introduced to us for the first time. Well, we always knew there was a Hyrule Castle, this is just our first time seeing it. We enter by sneaking into the sewer, where we see our dead uncle and take his gear. With it, we fight the mind-controlled knights until we reach the princess in the dungeon. We make our way back to the entrance and through a secret passage behind the throne room. This passage connects to the sanctuary, really the only safe place to leave Zelda as we are instructed to get the Master Sword. The Master Sword is introduced as another series first, and the reason why we have to get it is because it's the only way to purge an evil like Aghanim. In other games it's referred to as the Blade that Seals the Darkness, or the Blade of Evil's Bane. But that's in future titles. Seeing as this is the Master Sword's first appearance, there isn't much lore tied to it aside from it just being the thing that can defeat the evil guy, In order to get the Master Sword, Link must collect the pendants of courage, wisdom, and power as a way of proving he's worthy of the blade. The first is located in the Eastern Palace. Right outside we meet Sahasrahla. He's a descendant like the maidens, but he went into hiding. After defeating the boss and getting the pendant of courage, he gives us the Pegasus boots, a reoccurring item in the 2D Zelda games. This gives Link a speed boost, and in lore it is a treasure passed down by the families of the wise men. Sahasrahla gives us this treasure because he believes that we are the heroes spoken about in prophecy. Throughout this game there will be stones in dungeons that will allow us to talk to Sahasrahla, and sometimes Zelda, in order for them to assist us. It's kind of like a telepathy stone type thing. Why it's connected to Sahasrahla and Zelda? I don't know, but it has a triangle symbol on it, so it might be because it's connected with the royal family and the wise men. But that's just a mini theory. So the Pegasus boots have 2 uses. The first is running fast. The second is ramming into stuff, mainly trees that'll drop stuff like apples or rupees. But there's one place where it's necessary for story progression. There's a library where we can knock off a book from a top shelf. This book will be necessary for progressing the story. It's not used that often, but it's pretty important. The Book of Mudora. It is both a translation book of ancient Hylian text, and aside from the 4 story uses in the game, we won't see this book again until we get our hands on it in 2011. Jokes and theories aside, we need the book to read an inscription that gets us into the next palace. And you might recognize the next palace because we see it in the most recent Zelda game taking place centuries after this one. The final dungeon is all the way up in Death Mountain. After helping an old man get back to his home, he gives you a magic mirror saying that you'll need it if we accidentally wander into a magical transporter, which we actually do, and we need to do it in order to get to the Tower of Hera, the location of the final pendant. These magical teleporters take you to the Dark World. However, this is how many people accidentally wandered into here and vanished, and whenever someone wanders into here, they take a monstrous appearance that reflects their heart. That's why this guy looks like a horned beast, and this guy looks like Kirby. The more evil your heart is, the more monstrous you look. Which is why seeing Link in the form of a pink bunny after exiting the portal will always be hilarious, especially considering when he killed so many innocent soldiers who attacked him. I mean, sure, they were hypnotized, but it doesn't matter. He's a cute bunny now. Anyways, Link uses the mirror to get to the tower and reaches the top after getting the Moon Pearl. This item will stop him from turning into a bunny if he ever re-enters the Dark World. Link defeats the boss of the Tower of Hera, gets the final pendant, and makes his way through a forest filled with fake Master Swords. That is, until he reaches the real one. While Link unlocks the Master Sword through the pendants in the Book of Mudora, Zelda gets kidnapped and taken to Hyrule Castle. So we make our way there, scale the castle until we reach Aghanim at the top. By the time we get there though, it's too late as Zelda's already in the middle of being transported. After seeing Zelda vanish before our eyes, we face Aghanim and play the first ever game of Deathman's Volley. It's an attack in the Zelda series where it's basically a game of volleyball. That's all you really need to know. Rather than admitting defeat, however, he drags us both into the Dark World where Sir Hasrala speaks through us through the void, instructing us to free the 7 maidens from the 7 dark palaces. While Link does that, I think now's a good time to talk to all of you about the game's mechanics, as well as the new things that this game introduced to the franchise. After all, the kind of stories, items, progression told in future Zelda games all branched from this one. First of all, we have the return of the bow, the boomerang, the bomb, but we also have the introduction of upgradable weapons. Silver arrows were the only way to defeat Ganon in the first Zelda game, and the same thing applies here. But rather than being an item that you find, it's only obtainable through upgrading your bow. The boomerang stays relatively the same, but now it's faster and has more range. The bombs, however, can't be upgraded, but you can buy a stronger variant of them. Later Zelda games will introduce variations of the bomb, and variations of the other 2 weapons as well. Another returning item is the hammer from Zelda II. Although Zelda II didn't rely on weapons for its combat, the hammer is necessary for clearing paths, but that's only in the overworld. Here, it serves a similar purpose, but it also has the ability to flip over some enemies. Magical powder is used to transform enemies and sometimes objects or people, usually into something harmless. There's also the introduction of the fire rod and ice rod. You can also use the fire rod as a replacement for the lantern, because it's just the lantern, but with range. The shovel is another new item that'll appear in other Zelda games, but in this one its only purpose is to find more useful items. More specifically, the flute, which is basically just fast travel. A different looking flute served a similar purpose in Zelda I, but I forgot it existed because I never really used it except when necessary. In this game, the flute takes the form of a blue ocarina, and you can tell the developers loved it so much because they made a whole other game on it. But back to the shovel. It's not really used again in the game. It disappears from our inventory after we get the flute. You can only use the shovel again during the shoveling minigame near Kakariko Village. In the Game Boy Advance version of this game, however, it gets its own slot, but I don't know if there's any actual use for it. I think some of the more unique items are the bug-catching net. It's used for collecting fairies that'll heal you upon death, or bees that'll fight alongside you. Anytime you collect something with your net, it'll be kept in a bottle, which in games before Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were extremely hard to find, because you would only get about 4 of them a game. Except in Majora's Mask, because I think that Link gets like 6. Yeah, bottles were extremely hard to get, because you wouldn't really know where these bottles were located. They'd just be in the most randomest places. The same thing applies here. So this is where that tradition started. You can blame Link to the Past for that one. A pair of unique items are the Cane of Samaria, which can create blocks and damage enemies upon being touched. Also the Cane of... I never know how to pronounce it. Bjorn. Bjorna? I don't even know. Which makes a protective shield around Link. You don't really hear about the canes outside of this game, honestly. The Cane of Samaria appears in Oracle of Ages, and the spin-off Ancient Stone Tablets, and Cadence of Hyrule, but that one's a great game. You should watch my review on that one. The Cane of Bjorna wasn't as lucky to be featured in other games, but that's fair, because there are a lot of defense-granting items throughout the Zelda franchise. It was also upon further research for this video that I just discovered you can get both the bug collecting net and the Cane of Bjorna in the GameCube version of Soul Calibur 2, which is kind of cool, I'm not gonna lie. I think maybe I should try the Soul Calibur games. I guess the title of the most unfortunate item goes to the Magical Cape, which lets Link go invisible. It also appears in Four Swords Adventures, but I haven't played that title from beginning to end. Knowing how Four Swords works though, it's not really an item you can keep, so you'll eventually have to swap it out for another one. So not only does it not appear in any other Zelda game besides those two, in one of them it has limited use, And in the other one, it has limited use. The second coolest item probably has to be the 3 medallions, and yes, I tied all 3 of them. The Bombos medallion burns and engulfs all enemies on screen. The Ether medallion freezes all enemies on screen. And finally, the Quake medallion, which strikes so much fear into the enemies on screen that they all turn into Zols. The Bombos and Quake medallions are necessary to enter 2 of the dungeons. They also make a return in 4 Swords Adventures. The Ether medallion was forgotten, I guess. But the best item introduced in this game has to be the beloved hookshot. I don't care if it's a claw shot, a grappling hook, a grip shot, a long shot, or a switch hook. As long as it has the word hook and shot, it is a hook shot. And regardless of which version it is, I love it. It is the most fun item to use regardless of the circumstance. I love them all the same, despite the difference in name, mechanic, and appearance. And it all started here. But maybe I do like the claw shot a little bit more. Oh, and one more thing. Any item that isn't physical, like the ones that obviously use magic, those consume magic. This game introduces the all-new magic meter. You can see it there on the top left screen. You can upgrade it later to consume less magic when you use certain items. Hey, real quick, I just wanted to say thank you for watching this far into the video. Please subscribe and share this video. I'm really hoping to reach 3,000 subscribers soon, and that's really my goal for 2025. As well as the hope that this video outdoes my best video of 2024. So I want this video to reach 5,000 views, so any shares and likes would be much appreciated. I upload videos about games I grew up with, or games I just find interesting. And recently I've been turning my older uploads into shorts, just because I feel like those videos deserve more attention. If you'd like to check out more of my videos, I'll leave a link in the description below for more of my Kurffy's Catalog series. Oh, also follow me on my socials. Okay, back to the video. If you watch my video on SNES Mario games, I talked about how the Super Mario Mania Player's Guide really hooked me into the world of Mario through its art and character descriptions. I mentioned previously I owned the Link to the Past Player Guide, and that book also had the same effect on me. The fleshed out descriptions of A Link to the Past, the retelling of lore as well as illustrations accompanying it, illustrations of the game's opening moments especially, really opened my imagination to how I depicted the rest of the game's world. There was also a map that divided the Dark World and the Light World into areas. Aside from the names that we see entering the dungeons, this was the only way I would know what some of these areas were called. Especially if you miss little details in dialogue like me. You wouldn't have known that the Dark World's version of Kakariko Village is called the Village of Outcasts, or that the Dark World's Death Mountain is still called Death Mountain. Oh, and that reminds me, I forgot to mention Kakariko Village. In this game, it's just an ordinary village, but in future entries it'll be more important and part of the lore. But I'll go over that in my next Zelda video that hopefully won't take months to come out. Like this one. But back to the book, I really love the illustrations sprinkled throughout the book about the game, like the way that the soldiers are supposed to look, areas you visit throughout the game, and especially this art of the Master Sword. The Master Sword in this game is probably my favorite depiction, because rather than having the blue winged shaped guard, you know, the guard we see in all the other Zelda games, this one has a round yellow guard. And when it's upgraded, it takes really even more different appearances, which I love just as much. The only time the guard appears blue is in the overworld sprite, as well as the title screen. But that's probably why they kept it blue in the other iterations. Or maybe that's just how it was meant to be, and this was just a coloring error in the book. And all the other illustrations of the Master Sword of this time. A Link Between Worlds tries to copy the colors of the upgrades, but that game also updates the Master Sword model to look more current. Because the model is too clear to leave up to the imagination, it doesn't really hit the same like it did when I was a kid. Unlike the illustrations of the upgrades where you can see that it notably changes all around. Also, on an unrelated note, I refuse to believe the Master Sword in the Oracle games is the Master Sword. This is not the same type of sword. This one has a guard. Let me just quickly go over some things that the guide did. Depictions of the fairy fountain statues, a random 3D map of Hyrule, depictions of Hyrule's fashion, more illustrations of areas that you'll explore in the game, item illustrations, the Dark World trees, which if you didn't know are alive, the Dark World Palace and the monkey that helps you get into it. Also, hands down, one of my favorite depictions of rupees because they're differentiated by both color and size, rather than just color in future games. I really like the minigames that require you to use your bow and arrow, and I really love the depiction of it here in this illustration. The book is also the origin of the high-quality image of the imprisoning war that you see all Zelda YouTubers use. I love this picture. I really do. Oh, there's also this ominous depiction of Link touching a heart container. And speaking of which, I love how the guide gives you a chart of recommended hearts before taking on each dungeon. Alright, I think enough time's passed, let's go check back on Link. So he's rescued the maidens from the Palaces of Darkness. Now all that's left is to save Zelda from the final one, Turtle Rock. We get on the back of the dungeon, use the Quake Medallion, and then boom, we're in. As both a child and an adult. This is probably the most difficult dungeon in the whole game. This dungeon requires the player to use everything they learned throughout their journey to get to the boss. This means you gotta lock in, honestly. And also remember when to use certain items. You have to tap into your classic Zelda gamer instincts here, because this dungeon is not merciful in the slightest. I didn't mention it earlier, but there are also shield and armor upgrades in the game. And this dungeon has the final shield upgrade, a shield that can reflect beam attacks. Maybe this is supposed to be this game's version of the mirror shield. Who knows? Anyways, we defeat the boss, save Zelda like we saved all the other maidens, and then Zelda confesses that she believed we were the legendary hero this whole time from the moment we met. She tells us Ganon is in his tower, and that we have to hurry because he's about to pass through a gateway that'll take him back to the light world. Our mission now is to stop him before he does. The maidens serve a new purpose now, breaking the barrier that leads into Ganon's castle, which basically just turns on the escalator that'll let you up. Jokes aside, this is another tricky dungeon, just like Turtle Rock. Although, in my opinion, this one's a little bit more fair. Like, it'll also test your skills, but it won't throw anything unfair, like a random block-pushing trick that you wouldn't really think about. One of my favorite parts about this dungeon is it does my favorite thing that most Zelda games don't allow you to do, and that's re-challenging some of the past bosses, especially when it's re-challenging them after you've gained all the upgrades. In this dungeon, you encounter the Light World bosses and have to face them before fighting Ganon. Anyways, scaling up to the 7th floor of the tower, we come face to face with Aghanim. So we're too late. Ganon's crossed over, and now a much stronger Aghanim is holding us off from facing Ganon. He boldly proclaims that we won't be meeting him a second time. Play a little bit of Dead Man's Folly, and then we defeat him. Which, you'd think he'd blow up like all the other bosses, but I guess he's not because he's human. But out of nowhere, a ghost-like entity comes out of him, rises from him, and then takes the form of a bat and flies away. It's Ganon. Aghanim wasn't serving Ganon. He was his puppet, his alter ego. While Ganon was imprisoned in the Dark World, he somehow manifested this alter ego in the Light World. He flies back to the pyramid where Link starts his journey in the Dark World and crashes down onto the top of it. I don't know why I just punched my hand. I thought it'd be cool. You see, rather than escaping the Light World to exact his revenge, he flies over to the pyramid where the Triforce was hidden and is acting as its guard in order to prevent Link from wishing his downfall. You know, real quick, based on the way the story was going up till this point, I don't think the royal family even knew the exact location of the Triforce, even if it was in the Sacred Realm, especially after Ganon transformed it into the Dark World. So Ganon, as the last person to make a wish on the Triforce, knows where it is, and basically foils his own plan in conquering Hyrule by leading his enemy to his weakness. All Link has to do is defeat him. Ganon tries swinging his trident, shooting flaming bats rather, breaking the floor from under him, and trying to turn off the lights to make himself invisible to Link. But all it takes is a couple sword swings, fire casting, and silver arrows to defeat him. After that, the doorway to the Chamber of the Triforce opens up, and Link begins to hear the essence of the Triforce tell him, the stronger your wish, the more powerful the Triforce will express it, as well as telling Link that it can grant a good wish or a bad wish. Because of Ganon's wish to rule the world, he turned the Sacred Realms into the Dark World. But because Link defeated him, the Dark World will soon fade away. Now it's Link's turn to have his wish granted. And now, we see a sort of post-credits scene to the game. This is the first to do so, and I love when Zelda games do this. Seeing pretty much everyone's happy ending. The king is alive, the soldiers are no longer brainwashed, the princess and the maidens are back home, the sage that protected Zelda in the sanctuary is alive, Sahasrahla is back home, the bully and his friend return to the Light World. We also see the portals to the Dark World are inactive here. Link's uncle is alive. The flute boy recovers. I didn't mention him, but he owned the flute and then turned into a tree. And the Master Sword sleeps again. Forever. Well, it'll be pulled again from its pedestal in a few hundred years, but after that, the Master Sword sleeps again forever in this timeline. And with that, this chapter of Hyrule comes to a close. Now, similar to my Mario video, it wouldn't really be fair if I only talked about its original version. I also got to talk about this one. Just to show that the Game Boy Advance was a powerful system, there were a slew of remakes for this thing. About 37 or 38 of the remakes made for the Game Boy Advance were games that originated on the Super Nintendo. There's not much to note about the Game Boy Advance version of the game. Obviously, the screen size is a bit different. Something I noticed while playing the game is that the arrows and the hammer can break pots and skulls. Maybe it was to reflect the 3D Zelda games, which you can break pots with other items. The audio is a bit crunchy, same with the music, but you know, portable games at this time. Sound effects were also entirely different, and Link consistently uses voice lines from Ocarina of Time whenever he attacks or gets hit. Some people find that annoying. It didn't really bother me that much, honestly. I didn't even notice it at times. Also, in my opinion, I feel like Minish Cap was more annoying with the voice lines, but this one I instantly got used to. Some of the text has changed, but all around it relatively is still the same. The visuals look a little bit brighter in comparison to the original, but maybe that's just because it needed to look a little bit brighter since it was a handheld, and some people like to play in the dark. Or outside. Why did it take me so long to think about outside? Oh, also nothing big, but an entirely new dungeon. You see, this isn't a Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance. This is a Link to the Past including the new multiplayer adventure Four Swords, which also gives this game post-game content. Probably the only 2D Zelda other than Triforce Heroes, if I'm not mistaken. If you get the Master Sword in A Link to the Past, you can get it in Four Swords. And if you complete Four Swords, as well as defeating Ganon in A Link to the Past, you unlock the Palace of the Four Sword. In this dungeon, you have to fight probably my 4 favorite bosses in this game, coincidentally. After defeating them, you pull out a sword that they're guarding and unlock the final boss room, where you come face to face with 4 Shadow Links, all decked out with your gear. And beating this trial gives you the Dark World version of the end credit sequence, with all the dungeons, all the bosses, as well as a way of seeing all of your player data, like how many times you've used a certain item or how many enemies you've defeated. I'm gonna be honest with you, while making this video, rather than playing the Super Nintendo version, which I grew up with and I've played back to back to back a lot, I decided to play the Game Boy Advance version because I was curious about the differences. And as much as I wanted to experience this dungeon for the first time, I am currently stuck in the Swamp Palace because I can't find the last small key. I'm literally like 1 room away from the boss door. But I did beat Four Swords with my little sister. My first impression of the game is that it's really fun, especially when paired with the right people. My sister's my little gaming buddy, you know? I'll do a video on Four Sword in the future, but that'd have to be for a future video. Anyways, I love this era of Zelda. I love the way it impacted me as both a fan and a theorist. This version of Hyrule is so special to me, and arguably the most iconic. Even more iconic than the map of Zelda I. I mean, this version of Hyrule was revisited in an adventure that takes place centuries in the future, A Link Between Worlds, where that incarnation of Link has to face similar trials, and the events of Link to the Past are still a bit of a recent memory. Also in Japan, this game was known as Triforce of the Gods 2, so technically this game is A Link Between Worlds, or Zelda III 2. And in more recent years, this Hyrule was revisited in Echoes of Wisdom, where it's been over a millennia since the other 2 adventures. The old Death Mountain froze over and became Hebra Mountain. It's revealed that the lack of Gorons in A Link to the Past was because they founded a new Death Mountain to the west. The Hylians probably just didn't know about it because it was so high up. You know, this also explains why Death Mountain is in different positions between Zelda 1 and Zelda 3, because the old Death Mountain just froze over and the Gorons moved there. Another setup Echoes of Wisdom made between the 2 versions of Hyrule is why Link suddenly appears in the southmost part of the map of Zelda 1. Beyond the southern wall of this area in Zelda 1 probably lies Sawthorn Village? It's Southern Village, whatever. Or at least what remains of it, since most of the villages in this era were destroyed. Oh, and for those who don't know, the Gorons are a rock-eating race that was introduced in the next home console entry. Theories aside, it's incredible how this game bridges the gap between A Link to the Past's Hyrule and Zelda 1's Hyrule. And honestly, Zelda 1's Hyrule is the worst that any other Hyrule has had to endure. They just weren't ready. Why weren't they ready? It's because the events of Link to the Past and the games that follow lost the knowledge. With only a hint of past legends being ever recorded or at least found in the game, it had to be found through extensive research The people of this era don't know about the heroes. They don't remember Ganon. Even the sacred relic, the entire war fought over it. They endured such a long era of peace that they just weren't ready for the chaos that ensued during the events of Zelda I, or rather, leading up to it. I'm pretty sure the Triforce wasn't even mentioned in this game because its name was forgotten. They just referred to it as Prime Energy. Aside from this game's impact on the overall story of Zelda, you can also see how it impacted the next game in the series, Link's Awakening, a game I actually never beat until a few months ago. While I was waiting for Echoes of Wisdom, I decided to finally beat this guy, just because I really wanted to put it on my backlog account. And also I felt like it was a Zelda game worth playing. Yeah, but it was a long wait for Echoes of Wisdom. My copy didn't arrive until October. Honestly though, solid game. Apparently it was originally planned to be a Game Boy D-make of A Link to the Past, but spiraled off into its own story. It's the same Link from Zelda III, going off on an adventure overseas, and then being shipwrecked on Koholint Island. That's all I'll say about this game now, because I feel like it deserves its own video in the future. Look at me, I'm promising 2 future videos. After delaying this one for like 3.5 months? Ugh, the audacity, am I right? Anyways, if you'd like to play Zelda 1 and 2, you can play them on modern hardware through the Nintendo Switch Online subscription. Zelda 3 and its 4-sword variant are also available on Nintendo Switch Online through its subscription, although you'll need the online expansion to play the Game Boy Advance games. A Link Between Worlds is currently unavailable outside of buying it physically for the 3DS. If you can get your hands on either a 3DS or the game, then good luck, they're pretty pricey now. Echoes of Wisdom is the newest Zelda game for the Nintendo Switch, so as of this time, it is available both digitally and physically. And finally, Link's Awakening has 2 ways of being played. The original Game Boy version through Nintendo Switch Online, or the remake that was released a few years ago. If A Link to the Past or Earthbound ever get remade, I would want it in this art style. It is the same art style Echoes of Wisdom has as well. Although technically, because of Echoes of Wisdom, I guess Link to the Past was kind of remade? But not really. Anyways, this was my final video on the Super Nintendo games I grew up with from my dad's video game consoles, so next I will be moving on to the Nintendo 64 games I grew up with, or something obscure like the plug-and plays. So look forward to those in 2025. Oh, I spent hours recording this episode. Thank you for watching, everyone. God bless. I'll see you all in the next one, and Happy New Year's.